the White Star's crown jewel, birth of the unsinkable, at the genesis of a Leviathan, the White Star's ambition. The opening years of the 20th century were defined by a relentless industrial arms race, particularly across the volatile, commercially vital expanse of the North Atlantic. The prize was dominance and the battlefield was the sea. The White Star Line, under the strategic command of its chairman, J. Bruce Ismay, faced stiff competition from the Cunard Line, which had invested heavily in speed with its record-breaking liners, Lusitania and Mauritania. Ismay, supported by the formidable financial backing of J.P. Morgan's International Mercantile Marine Co. (IMM), decided on a radical shift in strategy. If speed was Cunard's selling point, White Star's would be size, stability, and sheer uncompromising luxury. This vision materialized as the Olympic-class liners. These ships were conceived to be floating extensions of the grandest hotels in London and Paris, designed to woo the wealthy elite who preferred comfort and security over a mere few hours saved on the crossing. The Titanic, yard number 401, was the second of this triumvirate, launched just after her sister ship Olympic. The contract was awarded to the Belfast shipbuilding firm of Harland and Wolff, a partner whose relationship with White Star was so close that it often blurred the lines of ownership. The construction of the Titanic commenced on March 31st, 1909. This was not a routine shipbuilding project. It demanded an unprecedented mobilization of resources and human ingenuity. The existing shipyard facilities were inadequate. They had to be virtually dismantled and rebuilt to accommodate the scale of the two colossal hulls, Olympic and Titanic, being built simultaneously. 2. The Harland and Wolff Forge, a symphony of steel and sweat. The most iconic symbol of this construction phase was the Errol gantry, towering 228 feet 69 meters high, stretching 840 feet 256 meters long. It was a massive skeletal structure, erected purely to house and service the two hulls. The gantry alone was a testament to Edwardian engineering, fitted with cranes and platforms to lift and position the gargantuan plates of steel. In the shadow of the gantry, the workforce swelled to nearly 3,000 men directly involved in the Titanic's construction, amidst a shipyard population of 15,000. These were the men, the riveters, the platers, the framers who forged the dream with their bare hands. The air was a perpetual echo chamber of industrial noise, the hissing of steam, the roar of the furnaces, and above all, the metallic thunder of the riveting gangs. The process of fixing the hull plates together was a brutal, relentless one. The Titanic required nearly 3 million rivets. The most skilled and dangerous job fell to the riveters, who worked in small teams, often suspended precariously hundreds of feet in the air. The heater boy fed the rivets into the fire until they glowed cherry red. The catcher snatched the searing metal and thrust it through the plate hole. The holder-up braced the head of the rivet with a heavy steel bar. And finally, the powerful riveter hammered the tail flat with a pneumatic gun. The speed and synchronization required were astonishing, yet the cost was often steep. Injuries, deafness, and occasional fatalities were tragic realities of working on the largest ship the world had ever seen. The hull alone consumed over 46,000 tons of steel, transforming the abstract vision into a physical, daunting reality. 3rd, Thomas Andrews and the design philosophy. The structural integrity and elegant design were the purview of Thomas Andrews, the brilliant, quietly intense chief naval architect at Harland and Wolff. Andrews was a man of precision, a perfectionist who had literally grown up in the yards, knowing every angle and stress point of the vessels he helped create. The Titanic was his magnum opus, a vessel he believed was truly revolutionary in its attention to safety. Andrews incorporated a robust double bottom, a second skin of steel plating, separated from the outer hull by several feet of structure. This was designed to protect the ship against minor beachings or submerged obstacles. The ship's principal safety feature, however, was its compartmentalization. The hull was divided into 16 major watertight compartments by 15 transverse bulkheads of solid steel. These bulkheads extended from the keel all the way up to the F deck, rising approximately 10 feet, 3 meters above the full load waterline. Each of these compartments was fitted with hydraulically and electrically operated doors that could be sealed instantly from the bridge, allowing the crew to isolate any damaged section. IV, the unsinkable myth, engineering confidence and fatal flaw. It was this meticulous design that fueled the narrative of the unsinkable ship. Andrews's calculations indicated that the Titanic could remain afloat even if any 4 of its 16 compartments were flooded. Given the previous maritime disasters, this seemed an almost foolproof design. The public, fueled by excited press reports, quickly discarded the qualified phrase, practically unsinkable, used by publications like The Shipbuilder, and embraced the absolute certainty of unsinkable. The Titanic became more than a ship. It was a symbol of industrial arrogance and man's supposed final mastery over the elements. Yet this confidence masked a fundamental design vulnerability, one that Andrews himself had supposedly argued against: the height of the bulkheads. They only rose to F deck just 10 feet above the waterline. Should the ship list or sink far enough for the water to rise above this height, it would cascade over the top of the bulkheads, spilling into the adjacent undamaged compartment. This process, known as progressive flooding, would defeat the very purpose of the watertight divisions, causing the ship to sink section by section, like an overturned ice cube tray filling up. Furthermore, while the hull plating was of high-quality mild steel, recent analysis of recovered wreck materials suggests that the wrought iron rivets used in the forward and aft sections of the hull may have been of a more brittle, lower-grade material, iron-rich in slag. These rivets were likely subjected to immense stress during the collision, possibly failing or popping rather than allowing the steel plates to tear cleanly, leading to the series of small, critical breaches that ultimately doomed the vessel. From hull to palace, the final refinement. The massive hull was successfully launched on May 31st, 1911, a moment of profound triumph witnessed by tens of thousands. The ship's physical presence, displacing over 26,000 tons even empty, was breathtaking. The next 10 months were dedicated to the meticulous task of fitting out. This was where the Titanic transformed into the floating palace of legend. Hundreds of craftsmen, carpenters, decorators, plumbers, and electricians installed the interiors. The first-class areas were breathtaking. The towering, carved oak grand staircase, the Turkish baths, the Parisian-style Café Parisien, and the expansive dining saloon. The ship's engines, 2 powerful triple expansion reciprocating engines and 1 low-pressure turbine, were installed, designed to provide a smooth, stable 21-knot cruising speed, emphasizing comfort over speed records. The Titanic stood ready, 882 feet 9 inches, 269 meters long, 175 feet 53 meters high from keel to the top of the funnels, and capable of carrying over 2,400 passengers and crew. It was the largest moving man-made object on Earth, a testament to the belief that the combination of wealth, ingenuity, and a little bit of arrogance could conquer the vast indifference of the North Atlantic. On April 2, 1912, the Titanic completed its sea trials, was certified seaworthy, and began its fateful journey to Southampton, ready to commence its only voyage across the ocean. The dream of the White Star Line was complete. The Unsinkable was born. Across the Atlantic, a symphony of Edwardian class and grandeur, the RMS Titanic was not merely a vessel of transport. It was a microcosm of Edwardian society, a towering metallic expression of the early 20th century's rigid social order and spectacular wealth disparity. When she pulled away from the quay at Southampton on April 10, 1912, she carried a manifest of over 2,200 souls, physically separated by the price of their ticket and the elevation of their cabins, yet all sailing toward the same distant shore and the same shared destiny. At the zenith of opulence, first-class society, the most exclusive society on Earth, floated on the decks of the Titanic. First class was the domain of the established aristocracy, the nouveau riche industrialists, and America's powerful financial and social elite. For the average passenger, a first-class ticket could cost a lifetime savings. For the most exclusive parlor suites, the price was astronomical, up to $870, equivalent to over $100,000 today. The ticket purchased not just passage, but a temporary elevation to a realm of unparalleled luxury. Their accommodation, strategically placed midships where the ship's motion was least felt, varied from comfortable standard staterooms to the lavish deluxe parlor suites on B and C decks. These suites, featuring 2 large bedrooms, a sitting room, 2 walk-in wardrobes, a private bathroom, and in some cases, a private promenade deck, were decorated in a variety of historical styles, Louis XVI, Georgian, and Queen Anne, offering the sensation of a fine country house rather than a ship at sea. The grand staircase. This was the beating heart of first-class society. Rising 10 decks high, capped by an elaborate glass dome and adorned with carved oak balustrades, chandeliers, and decorative panels, the staircase was a masterpiece of craftsmanship. It was the stage upon which the wealthy performed their daily rituals, descending to dinner or ascending to the sunlit boat deck. Public spaces and amenities. First-class passengers enjoyed a host of unprecedented amenities at sea. The dining saloon on D-deck, spanning the full width of the ship, was the largest room afloat, paneled in French light brown walnut. The a la carte restaurant and the charming, latticework enclosed Café Parisien offered an exclusive, paid-for dining option, serving a multi-course French-style cuisine, further separating the old money from those who settled for the standard. First-class dining. Gentlemen could retreat to the mahogany-paneled smoking room, while ladies often used the elegant reading and writing room. Leisure was taken seriously. The Titanic boasted a modern gymnasium, a squash court, a Turkish bath complex with hot, temperate, and cooling rooms, and the first heated swimming pool at sea. Available for an extra dollar fee, key first-class characters: Colonel John Jacob Astor IV and his young pregnant wife, Madeline, a scion of one of America's wealthiest families, traveling home from an extended honeymoon to avoid the gossip surrounding his recent divorce and remarriage. Benjamin Guggenheim, an American mining magnate, traveling with his mistress, accompanied by his valet and chauffeur. He embodied the confidence and recklessness of America's emerging class of industrialist millionaires. Isidore and Ida Strauss, co-owners of Macy's department store, an elderly couple whose devotion to one another was legendary, representing the more stable, philanthropic wealth of the era. 2. The emerging middle, second-class respectability. Below the opulence of the first class was the solid, respectable world of second class, often compared favorably to the first-class accommodations on older liners. Second class was the domain of the burgeoning middle class: academics, clergymen, journalists, middle-ranking businessmen, and British and American families. Many were professionals, or well-to-do tourists making the crossing for leisure or short business trips. Second-class cabins, located generally further aft and on the middle decks, were modest but comfortable, typically accommodating 2 or 4 passengers with bunk beds, a sofa, and a wash basin. They did not have private bathrooms, but shared facilities were clean and abundant. Amenities and life. Second-class passengers were largely self-contained, not permitted access to first-class areas. They enjoyed their own large dining saloon on D-deck, where meals rivaled those of a quality regional hotel, a dedicated library, and a separate smoking room for gentlemen. The second-class promenade, where they could stroll and play deck games like shuffleboard. The 8 ship musicians, though employed by a private agency under contract to White Star, were accommodated in second class. They were a visible, unifying feature, playing to all classes throughout the day. 3. The hope of the future. Third class and the American dream. If the upper decks were the home of established wealth, the lower decks, particularly the bow and stern sections, housed the dreamers. The third class, often referred to by the outdated term steerage. They were an international collection of humanity, over 700 passengers from 24 different countries, primarily immigrants from Ireland, Scandinavia, Finland, and Lebanon, all seeking a new life in the United States and Canada. Their purpose for traveling was fundamental: the American dream. They were fleeing poverty, famine, or political strife, carrying their meager possessions and vast hopes across the ocean. Accommodation and conditions. Though considered basic, the third-class accommodations on the Titanic were revolutionary compared to the crowded, dormitory-style steerage of older ships. Passengers were placed in small, relatively private cabins, generally housing 2, 4, or 6 people in bunk beds, though sometimes up to 10 for single men. Single men were segregated in the forward section, single women in the aft, with families housed midships. The food was simple but wholesome and plentiful, served in the third-class dining saloon on F-deck. This was a massive improvement over older liners where passengers often had to bring their own provisions. Despite these improvements, the class divide was stark and rigidly enforced. Sanitation, third class had a severely limited shared bathing facilities. Only 2 bathtubs were available for all male passengers on the voyage. Segregation, physical barriers, locked gates, doors, and fences prevented third-class passengers from moving freely to the higher decks, even to the second-class areas. This was enforced due to U.S. immigration laws requiring segregation, but it was a clear manifestation of the Edwardian social hierarchy. Social isolation. The lower decks, with their labyrinthine corridors in close proximity to the thrumming engines, were noisy and isolated from the rest of the ship. Their public spaces were limited to the dining saloon and the poop deck at the stern. Vital. If crowded open-air area where they gathered, shared their dreams, and sought respite from the close quarters. Key third-class characters. Fictionalized composite. The O'Brien family, a young, hopeful Irish family, father, mother, and 2 children, leaving the hardship of County Cork to join relatives in Chicago. Their ticket bought with years of savings, their future resting entirely on the success of this voyage. Sven Larsson, a young, solitary Swedish farmer, heading to Minnesota with a small inheritance, hoping to buy land and start a new life. A man of few words but immense, quiet determination. Heavy, the unseen machinery, crew, and hierarchy. Binding these 3 worlds together was the ship's crew of over 900. They were the true workers of this floating city, themselves divided into a rigid hierarchy. The deck crew, officers, sailors who managed navigation and safety. The engineers, firemen, and trimmers, the black gang who worked in the fiery, hellish depths of the boiler rooms, shoveling up to 600 tons of coal per day to feed the massive engines. They were dirty, unseen, and essential. The victualling department, stewards, cooks, waiters, the largest segment of the crew, dedicated entirely to serving the passengers. Their lives were dictated by the demands of the wealthy, constantly on call, changing their uniforms multiple times a day, ensuring the flawless operation of the palace above the water. The Titanic was therefore a complete social structure on a maiden voyage, a stunning temporary civilization that mirrored the world it had just left. The lines of division were clear and the privileges explicit. As the ship sailed west, the first class dined on 10-course meals of unparalleled refinement. The second class enjoyed the respectable comforts of the new middle class. And the third class dreamt of liberty and land in America, all oblivious to the fact that the very design meant to demonstrate the ultimate mastery of man over nature held a fatal flaw, and that the rigid hierarchy they sailed under would soon be tested by the absolute, indifferent equality of the ICC. This extended segment, focusing on the social and architectural divisions, provides a detailed backdrop for your historical
story and is approximately
200 words in length. Combined with the first segment, this gives you a strong, detailed foundation. Would you like me to continue the story with the third subtitle? The Watchman's Fateful Message, Warnings from the Icy North. Auspicious commencement, the maiden voyage from Southampton. At the 10th of April, dawn of a dream. The air on the morning of Wednesday, April 10, 1912, was crisp and held the promise of spring. Yet a faint metallic tang of coal dust hung over the docks of Southampton, England. This was the day the RMS Titanic was scheduled to begin her maiden voyage, a passage meant to etch her name into the annals of maritime history. Not as a tragedy, but as the zenith of commercial sea travel, the enormous dockside Pier 44 was a scene of controlled pandemonium. Steamers, ferries, and trains had disgorged the full complement of passengers, from the frock-coated millionaires arriving in their Rolls-Royces to the third-class immigrants who arrived in crowded special trains, clutching their cloth bags and small, precious worldly possessions. The ship's own vast complement of over 900 crew members had already arrived, preparing the floating city for its grand debut. The sheer scale of the ship was overwhelming. When she sat alongside the quay, her black hull towered higher than the surrounding buildings. Her 4 massive funnels, 3 functional, 1 for ventilation, seemed to touch the sky. It was a sight that inspired awe and, for many, an unquestioning sense of invincibility. Tau, Captain Smith, the grand old man of the White Star Line. Presiding over this majestic undertaking was Captain Edward John Smith, the Commodore of the White Star Line fleet, a man with a commanding presence, a full white beard, and a calm, reassuring manner. Captain Smith was arguably the most famous and trusted ship captain in the world. Affectionately known as the Millionaire's Captain, he had ferried the elite of society across the Atlantic for decades without incident. This voyage was to be his grand swan song. Smith had announced his retirement following the Titanic's return from her maiden trip. The owners of the line, and indeed the public, felt a deep sense of security knowing EJ was at the helm. His presence was part of the luxury package for first class passengers like the Astors and Strausses, who specifically requested his command. He was the human face of White Star's confidence, the seasoned hand guiding the ultimate. The crew was a city unto itself. The Black Gang, the stokers and firemen, were already deep in the fiery heat of the boiler rooms on G-deck, shoveling the 600 tons of coal necessary to stoke the 29 immense boilers. Above them, the stewards, nearly 350 strong, were ensuring every cabin was immaculate, every dining table set, and every whim of the first-class passengers catered to. The 8 officers on the bridge, led by Chief Officer Henry Wilde and First Officer William Murdoch, were performing the final checks, a meticulous routine of navigation and safety that on this day seemed almost superfluous given the quality of the ship beneath their feet. A close shave, the New York incident. The excitement of departure was almost immediately tempered by a sudden, jarring near disaster, a minor incident that in hindsight would be seen as a chilling harbinger of the fragility of the colossal vessel. At noon sharp on April 10th, the Titanic began her initial maneuver to pull away from the dock. Tug strained against the hull, slowly guiding her out into the deep water channel. As the Titanic began to pass the adjacent berth, the enormous amount of water displaced by her movement, known as suction, created a powerful current. This current violently snapped the mooring lines of the much smaller, laid-up White Star liner, the RMS New York, which was docked nearby. The New York, suddenly free, began to drift dangerously toward the Titanic's towering hull. On the bridge, Captain Smith and the harbor pilot reacted instantly. Engines were reversed, whistles blared, and the tugboats worked furiously to pull the 2 ships apart. The New York was averted by a matter of mere feet. Terrifyingly close shave, that delayed the departure by over an hour. Passengers on both ships witnessed the near collision with gasps, the sudden, brutal reminder that even this unsinkable ship operated at the mercy of physical forces. For some, it was a moment of profound unease, a strange and inauspicious omen on the very first hour of the maiden voyage.
North Atlantic's alarms, warnings from the icy North Eye, the unwavering pace, chasing efficiency, not records the days following the departure from Queenstown. April 11th, 12th, and 13th were characterized by a glorious, unblemished calm. The North Atlantic was unusually tranquil, the weather bright and the sea flat as glass, deceptively benign. The RMS Titanic steamed westward with unwavering speed, maintaining a powerful cruising rate of approximately 21 knots, about 24 miles per hour, while many contemporary accounts and subsequent narratives suggest that Captain Smith or White Star Chairman J. Bruce Ismay were racing the ship to set a new speed record. The reality was more nuanced. The Titanic was not built for speed like the Cunard rivals. Her design prioritized size and luxury. However, maintaining high speed was crucial for demonstrating the efficiency and promptness expected of a prestigious new liner. An early arrival in New York would confirm the vessel's supremacy and ensure positive press. Ismay, keenly aware of the ship's reputation, actively pushed for maximum performance. He was frequently seen on the bridge, discussing speed with the engineers and officers. The ship's performance was impeccable. She was stable, smooth, and fast. The confidence on the bridge was infectious, bordering on overconfidence. The prevailing maritime wisdom of the era held that, in clear weather, a well-manned ship could always spot an iceberg in time to maneuver around it, making a reduction in speed seem unnecessary. Aye, the ether awakens. Radio warnings begin throughout the long, relatively uneventful days. The ship's wireless room, located in the superstructure and operated by the Marconi Company's junior officer, Harold Bride, and senior operator, Jack Phillips, hummed with activity. The wireless system was primarily seen not as a safety feature, but as a passenger convenience, a luxury amenity that allowed the first-class passengers to send and receive personal telegrams, known as marconigrams, to friends and business associates on shore. As the Titanic sliced deeper into the North Atlantic shipping lanes, the messages began to change. Interspersed with the social chit-chat and stock reports came increasingly urgent meteorological and navigational warnings. The officers on the bridge, particularly First Officer William Murdoch, understood the implications. The ship was entering the dangerous cold water region known as the Grand Banks, where the southbound Labrador Current often carried massive chunks of icebergs, far into the main shipping lanes. April 13th, the first scattered warnings arrived. A message from the German steamer SS America detailing a large iceberg field was received by the Titanic. The warnings were routine enough that they did not immediately trigger alarm. They were noted, but the speed remained the same. Aye. The critical messages of April 14th, Sunday, April 14th, dawned clear, bright, and intensely cold. The air temperature steadily dropped throughout the day, indicating the proximity of large fields of ice. This was the day the warnings became persistent and specific. 9:00 a.m., SS Caronia. The first major warning of the day came from the Cunard liner Caronia, reporting bergs and growlers, smaller pieces of ice near the Titanic's path. This message was properly relayed to Captain Smith, who acknowledged it and posted it on the chart room bulletin board for the officers to see. 1:42 p.m., SS Baltic. An even more explicit warning arrived from the White Star liner Baltic. The message, relayed from the Greek steamer Athenae, described much ice and large number of derelicts in the immediate vicinity of the Titanic's track. Captain Smith was dining in the first-class saloon when this was delivered. He showed the message to J. Bruce Ismay, who placed it in his pocket, seemingly unconcerned, and later returned it to the bridge with a casual acknowledgement. The lack of immediate action by Ismay who had no official command authority, was a subtle sign of the culture of complacency. 7:30 p.m. SS California. The most critical warning was sent from the steamer SS California, which had deliberately stopped for the night after finding itself surrounded by heavy pack ice. The Californian's message was precise, reporting 3 large icebergs at their position. This message, however, was not delivered to the bridge. Why? Because the message began with the less urgent MSG prefix, rather than the mandatory ice report indicator, and was not deemed immediate. 9:40 p.m. SS Mesaba. Another explicit and geographically relevant warning came from the steamer Mesaba. It reported much field ice and large icebergs in the path ahead. This message, tragically, never reached the bridge at all. IV. The failure to prioritize and the busy airwaves, the most significant failure in safety protocol that day lay in the communication chain, or lack thereof. The 2 wireless operators, Phillips and Bride, were overwhelmed by the deluge of commercial markinigrams being transmitted by the passengers. First-class passengers, enjoying the novelty of communicating with shore, kept the operators frantically busy. Jack Phillips, exhausted from a long day of fielding passenger requests and wrestling with a broken wireless set, was acutely stressed. When the 9:40 p.m. Mesaba warning came in, he was focused on clearing the backlog of lucrative passenger messages. Later, shortly before 11 o'clock p.m., the nearby SS California, whose captain had decided to anchor for the night due to the ice, attempted one last time to warn the Titanic. Junior wireless operator Cyril Evans messaged, "Say, old man, we are stopped and surrounded by ice." Phillips, frustrated by the interruption to his commercial traffic, irritably snapped back, Shut up, you're jamming my signal. I'm working Cape Race." Evans, deciding that the giant ship's operator was too busy or rude to listen, simply turned off his equipment for the night and went to bed. The Titanic, just 10 to 20 miles away from the Californian, now sailed blindly and swiftly into the ice field, having silenced the very voice that could have saved her. The silent approach. A night of deceptive calm, the evening of April 14th was eerily beautiful. The sky was clear, the stars shone with exceptional brilliance, and crucially, the sea was utterly calm, smooth as glass, as many survivors later recalled. This flat calm was another fatal contributor. Icebergs are typically spotted by the white foam or surf that breaks against them, created by the constant undulation of the ocean waves. Without waves, there was no telltale foam. Moreover, the air temperature had dropped to a dangerous 32 F0C. The lookouts in the Crow's Nest, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, had been sailing without binoculars, which had inexplicably been left behind in Southampton. In the dark, the black, wet base of the iceberg would have been nearly invisible against the black, calm water. As the clock ticked past 11 o'clock p.m., the ship was a scene of serene confidence. In first class, the final dinner guests were moving to the smoking room. In second class, the lights were dimming. In third class, the music had subsided. The massive ship cut through the silent, freezing water at 22 knots, her 3 giant propellers driving her inexorably forward. A powerful, unstoppable force unknowingly rushing toward an immovable object. The warnings had been sounded across the Atlantic, but the combination of arrogance, commercial prioritization, and unfortunate atmospheric conditions had ensured they were rendered useless. The ship's date with destiny was now measured not in hours, but in minutes. This section now details the critical failure in communication, the atmosphere of overconfidence, and the specific factors that made the iceberg virtually invisible on that particular night, setting the stage for the collision. Would you like to continue the story with the 5th subtitle, The Grazing Blow, an Unheeded Impact in the North Atlantic Night? Collision, the grazing blow. An unheeded impact in the North Atlantic night, I the watch in the Crow's Nest. Blindness in the dark, the time was precisely 11:39 p.m. on the night of Sunday, April 14, 1912. The air in the crow's nest, perched high on the forward mast, was biting, the temperature hovering just below freezing. Lookout Frederick Fleet and his partner, Reginald Lee, were on watch. They were straining their eyes into a darkness so absolute that it was almost tactile. There was no moon, the sea was utterly flat, and the only light came from the brilliant, cold pinpricks of the stars above. Fleet and Lee had been intensely vigilant, aware of the sharp drop in temperature and the standing orders to keep a keen lookout for ice. Yet, their task was severely handicapped. Due to an administrative error in Southampton, the binoculars intended for the lookouts were locked away in a storage cabinet, the key for which had been left behind. They were forced to rely solely on the naked eye, a debilitating handicap given the specific conditions. The extreme calm of the sea, which usually provided the safety net of detecting an iceberg by the telltale white foam breaking at its base, was now their greatest enemy. The berg ahead was black, wet, and presented a low, shimmering profile against the equally black water. It was the ultimate camouflage. Aye, aye. Iceberg right ahead. The fateful sighting at 11:40 p.m., Frederick Fleet's gaze snagged on something darker than the surrounding water, a sudden mass looming dead ahead, rapidly growing in size. It was a monstrous, jagged shape of ancient blue ice, the main body of the iceberg. It was impossibly close. Fleet immediately struck the bell 3 times, the signal for danger dead ahead, and grabbed the internal telephone that connected directly to the bridge. The voice of 6th Officer James Moody answered. "What do you see?" Moody asked sharply. Fleet's voice, though normally steady, was urgent. "Iceberg right ahead." Moody instantly acknowledged the warning and relayed it to the duty officer on the bridge, 1st Officer William Murdoch. "Aye, aye, aye." Murdoch's critical command. Too fast, too late. 1st Officer Murdoch, a cool, experienced sailor, had barely seconds to react, a delay that would cost thousands of lives. Traveling at approximately 22 knots, 37 feet per second, the iceberg was now less than 400 yards away and closing fast. In a desperate, instinctive attempt to steer the massive ship clear, Murdoch barked 2 vital orders. Hard a starboard, a command to turn the wheel as far as possible to the right, which in turn would swing the ship's bow sharply to the left. Full speed astern, a command to reverse the engines in a frantic attempt to slow the ship's forward momentum. The engines were quickly thrown into reverse, causing the huge hull to shudder. Below decks, the engineers in the engine room heard the sudden jolt of the telegraph and reacted immediately. The rudder, however, operates like a small paddle, and a ship of the Titanic's immense size and momentum requires a significant amount of time and distance to alter course, especially when moving at high speed. It takes time for water to begin pushing the rudder, and even longer for the ship to respond. The bow began to swing slowly to port left. For a terrifying 10 seconds, it seemed as if the maneuver might work. IV, the fatal kiss, a series of breaches it was not to be. At 11:40 p.m. and 30 seconds, the bow cleared the main mass of the iceberg, but the momentum of the Titanic's huge, 882-foot-long hull continued to carry the starboard side alongside the underwater, submerged spur of the ice, the invisible, fatal section. The collision was not a dramatic, head-on impact, which the ship was built to withstand. Instead, it was a grazing blow, a continuous scrape that ran for about 10 seconds, extending approximately 300 feet, 91 meters along the ship's starboard hull, from the forecastle deck back past the number 3 boiler room. The immense pressure of the scrape, compounded by the speed and the cold-induced brittleness of the hull plates and iron rivets, did not create one long, clean gash. Instead, the force caused the steel plates to buckle inward, popping the heads of the vulnerable wrought iron rivets and separating the plates along their seams. The result was a series of 6 narrow, cumulative breaches that allowed the freezing water of the Atlantic to rush directly into the forward 5 watertight compartments. VDOT, the deceptive sound and feel of disaster for many passengers, The moment of collision was almost anticlimactic, a deceptive jolt that did not scream catastrophe. Below decks, third class and crew, the impact was much more pronounced. The black gang in the boiler rooms and the third-class passengers in the forward section reported a pronounced shudder, a grinding, tearing sound like rolling thunder, or the sound of dragging a chain. Within seconds, the water was pouring in. Fireman George Beauchamp later testified that he saw a great big tear in the side of the boiler room near the floor. In first-class upper decks, the sensation was much more subtle. Passengers spoke of a shivering motion, a trembling, or a sound like scraping a stick along a fence. Many who were awake simply dismissed it as a large wave, a minor propeller vibration, or a slight jarring caused by the reversing engines. Millionaire Colonel John Jacob Astor famously remarked, after the noise subsided, that he had gone out on deck and seen ice, but the ship seemed fine. He then returned to his stateroom to calmly read a book. The sheer size and stability of the Titanic instilled a fatal confidence. It felt too big, too grand, to have suffered any serious injury from such a minor jolt. Within minutes, the engines were stopped completely. An unnatural, profound silence descended upon the great liner, broken only by the hiss of steam being released from the funnels. This silence, coupled with the increasingly cold air and the subtle list to starboard, was the first true indicator that something was terribly wrong. The unseen damage below the waterline had sealed the fate of the Titanic. This section now details the final, fatal minute leading up to the collision, the immediate actions on the bridge, and the tragically subtle nature of the impact as experienced by the passengers. Would you like to continue the story with the 6th subtitle? A false sense of security, the first hours of disaster on the decks. Water waved the death grip of the unsinkable. Inflow and emergency eye the silent assessment. Designer Thomas Andrews inspects the damage, the profound, unnatural silence that fell over the RMS. Titanic immediately following the 11:40 p.m. impact was more unsettling than any noise. The engines were still. The vibrations had ceased. On the bridge, Captain Edward Smith, though initially dismissive of the minor shudder, quickly realized the gravity of the situation upon receiving reports of water surging into the forward compartments. The most critical figure in the subsequent hour was the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews. As was custom for the Guarantee Group, Andrews had been asleep in his cabin, C-106. He was immediately summoned to the bridge by Captain Smith. Andrews carried his blueprints and his detailed knowledge of the Titanic's structure, the only man aboard who truly understood the mathematical limit of the vessel's survival. Between 11:45 p.m. and 12:15 a.m., Andrews and Captain Smith, accompanied by a carpenter, descended to the lower decks. Their inspection was swift and harrowing. They found water pouring into the lowest levels. The mail room was already swamped, sacks of mail bobbing in the frigid seawater. They confirmed that the collision had breached the starboard side across a length of approximately 300 feet, allowing the sea to rush into the first 6 forward compartments. Specifically, they saw damage extending into the forepeak storage area. Number 1, hold number 2, hold number 3, boiler room, number 4, boiler room, slight seepage into no. 5, boiler room, the sheer volume of water entering the first 5 compartments was catastrophic. The compartments were no longer just holding water. The weight was pushing the bow down, forcing the water level higher. Aye. The fatal calculation. A Guarantee overruled Andrews' return to the bridge, his face pale but his voice firm and professional. Captain Smith waited for the verdict that would define the next 2 hours and, ultimately, the fate of the 2,200 souls aboard. Andrews' initial design had proudly guaranteed that the Titanic could remain afloat, even if 4 of her watertight compartments were completely flooded. This was the core of the unsinkable claim, but the reality of the damage was grim. Murdoch's quick turn had saved the ship from a devastating head-on smash, but the long, shallow scrape had instead fatally breached 5 of the forward compartments. Andrews laid out the inescapable conclusion. The forward momentum of the progressive flooding could not be stopped. As the bow settled deeper into the water would eventually crest the top of the dividing bulkheads, which only rose 10 feet above the waterline, spill over into the 6th compartment, and then the 7th, initiating the unstoppable chain reaction of sinking. "The ship is doomed," Andrews is reported to have stated simply, with agonizing clarity. "She is certain to sink." When pressed by Captain Smith for a timeline, Andrews estimated that the colossal ship had, at most, an hour and a half, perhaps 2 hours, until around 2 o'clock a.m., before she would slide beneath the waves. The revelation was crushing. The most magnificent example of human engineering was now subject to the immutable laws of physics. Aye. The order given, preparation and delay at approximately 12:15 a.m., Captain Smith, absorbing the full weight of the truth, gave 2 simultaneous, momentous orders. To the wireless room, send the call for assistance. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride immediately began transmitting the standard distress signal, CQD, a call that would soon be superseded by the new international distress signal, SOS. This was the first time in history a ship used the SOS signal in a true emergency. To the officers, get the passengers up and put their lifebelts on. The second order met with massive resistance, not from the crew, but from the passengers themselves. On the upper decks, life was proceeding almost normally. It was cold, yes, and the engines were off, but many passengers were reluctant to leave their warm, luxurious cabins to venture out into the icy night simply to put on an unsightly cork lifebelt. The first and second class stewards were diplomatic, attempting to frame the dressing as a precaution or a drill. The general mood remained one of utter disbelief. The Titanic was unsinkable. The ship's stability was so absolute that the subtle bow-down angle was not yet noticeable to those on the boat deck. This initial delay, born of fatal confidence, cost precious minutes. IV. The first SOS and the silent Californian, the wireless distress calls sent out by Phillips and Bride, were answered almost immediately by several ships, including the Cunard liner RMS Carpathia, which was over 58 miles away. Captain Arthur Rostron of the Carpathia immediately ordered his ship to race toward the Titanic's position at top speed, pushing his engines far beyond their normal limit. Rostron's commitment was absolute, but the distance meant a minimum of 4 hours before they could arrive. Tragically, the ship closest to the Titanic, the SS Californian, only 10-20 miles away, likely visible to the naked eye, received nothing. Her wireless operator, Cyril Evans, had gone to bed just moments before the collision, having been rudely dismissed by the overworked Phillips. Though the Californian's crew saw a mysterious light on the horizon, the signals were not understood or acted upon. An agonizing failure of protocol and proximity. The rockets ascend, signaling desperation as the flooding progressed and the bow settled deeper. The true extent of the emergency could no longer be disguised. The deck became noticeably angled forward. At 12:45 a.m., Captain Smith gave the desperate order to launch the distress rockets. Quartermaster George Rowe fired the first white signal rocket. 8 were fired in total over the next hour and a half, soaring 600 feet into the cold, black sky before bursting into brilliant white stars. These rockets were a universally understood signal of extreme distress at sea, but their effect on the passengers was varied. For the crew, the rockets were a terrifying confirmation that the unsinkable ship was indeed sinking, initiating the final, frantic stage of the evacuation. For the passengers, many, still under the spell of the Titanic's reputation, simply mistook the dazzling white flashes for a celebratory flourish or fireworks, another novelty provided by the opulent White Star Line. However, the sight of the rockets, coupled with the increasing chill and the obvious listing of the deck, began to erode the false sense of security. The long-guarded truth that the ship was dying began to spread, not through an official announcement, but through the escalating angle of the deck and the sheer desperation rising into the cold, rocket-streaked night sky. The time for denial was over. The time for the lifeboats had begun. This section accurately details Thomas Andrews' inspection, the fatal 5 compartments diagnosis, the initial reluctance of passengers, and the critical failure of the wireless system, all set against the backdrop of the first distress signals.
For the first legs, Cherbourg and Queenstown. After the New York incident was resolved, the Titanic finally steamed out of Southampton. The first short leg of the journey took her across the English Channel to Cherbourg, France, a port chosen to pick up the most elite of the passengers. Here, at 5:30 p.m., the French tender Nomadic ferried the likes of Colonel Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, and other continental elites out to the waiting Titanic. Cherbourg also saw off a number of passengers, including Father Francis Brown, an amateur photographer whose iconic images of the ship's interior would become the last visual record of the Titanic's life. The next morning, April 11th, the Titanic made her final stop at Queenstown, now Cove, Ireland. This was the last port of call before the open Atlantic. Queenstown was the staging point for the vast majority of the third class, passengers primarily young Irish men and women, filled with optimism, waving farewell to their homeland, destined for new lives in New England or the American Midwest. The tender America brought these final 120 passengers, along with the last bags of mail, earning the ship the RMS, or Royal Mail Steamer designation. At 1:30 p.m. on April 11th, the Titanic raised anchor and steamed out of Queenstown Harbor. The ship now carried 2,224 souls, passengers and crew, first settling in the festival on the waves. As the Irish coast receded, the full weight of the journey began. The ship turned west, heading directly into the vastness of the Atlantic Ocean, setting a course for New York. The atmosphere was one of celebration, a festival on the waves. In first class, the atmosphere was electric. The first grand dinner of the voyage, an elaborate 10-course affair, was held that evening. The wealthy gathered in the vast dining saloon, a glittering array of jewels, silks, and tailored tuxedos. Conversations flowed around stock markets, politics, and social gossip, all underscored by the discreet music of the ship's band. Bruce Ismay himself was often seen among the most powerful guests, basking in the success of his magnificent creation. In second class, the tone was one of quiet satisfaction. Passengers settled into their cabins, pleased with the comforts and the sense of respectable passage. Card games and reading in the library dominated the evenings, a comfortable buffer between the luxury above and the teeming hope below. In third class, the journey was a profound communal experience. Despite the cramped quarters, there was an infectious sense of excitement. Families gathered in the general room, where a piano was played and impromptu dancing began, a traditional Irish jig or a Scandinavian folk tune, and a genuine celebration of escape and future hope. Young immigrants, strangers just days before, formed bonds based on their shared quest for the American dream. The lifeboat frenzy, struggle and heroism for survival. The stark reality, too many people, too few boats. The official order to uncover and load the lifeboats was given around 12:20 a.m., approximately 40 minutes after the collision. The reality of the Titanic's safety provisions immediately became the central, horrifying tragedy of the night. The great liner was equipped with only 20 lifeboats, enough to hold 1,178 people. This represented less than 53% of the total number of people on board, over 2,200. This deficit was not due to cost cutting. Rather, it was a compliance with outdated British Board of Trade regulations that calculated lifeboat capacity based on the ship's tonnage size, rather than its passenger capacity. Indeed, Thomas Andrews had argued for more boats, but the owners had resisted, fearing the clutter would spoil the aesthetics of the expansive promenade decks. The physical loading and lowering process was fraught with difficulties. The crew, many of whom were stewards with no training in lifeboat procedures, were inexperienced. The lowering gear, the davits, had been tested to support the weight of the boats, but the process of lowering them 70 feet down the steep hull side into the cold black water was a slow and nerve-wracking affair. 2. The fatal compliance, half-empty boats. The first lifeboat to be lowered was lifeboat number 7 from the starboard side, at 12:45 a.m. It had a capacity for 65 people, but it was lowered with only 28 people aboard. This agonizing waste of capacity became the dominant, tragic pattern of the early hours. There were several reasons for the half-full boats. Disbelief and complacency. Many first and second class passengers refused to board the boats, convinced the Titanic was safer than the tiny vessels bobbing in the freezing sea. The officers frequently had to beg people to get in. Lack of direction. Captain Smith's command to officers was vague, leading to two different interpretations. First Officer William Murdoch, starboard side, interpreted the rule as women and children first, allowing men to enter if there were no women or children present. Second Officer Charles Lightoller, port side, interpreted the rule as women and children only, often resulting in boats leaving, the rail severely underfilled, even when men were standing nearby begging to board. Fear of lowering. The sight of the boats swaying violently as they were lowered, coupled with the long drop, terrified many who feared the boat would be smashed against the ship's hull before it reached the water. Lifeboat number 1, a small emergency cutter capable of holding 40 people, was notoriously lowered with only 12 people aboard, including 5 wealthy first-class passengers and 7 crew. This blatant self-preservation by the elite, later dubbed the millionaires' boat, became a symbol of the night's inequity. Third, the rising panic and the social divide. As the bow dipped further and the angle of the deck increased, the atmosphere shifted rapidly from complacency to desperation. Water began pouring onto the forward parts of the A-deck promenade, and the sounds of the ship's internal structure groaning began to be heard. The true state of emergency finally struck the passengers. The strict social hierarchy that governed the Titanic in life now governed the order of death. First and second class, their access to the lifeboats on the boat deck was direct and immediate. Though they faced chaos and the terror of the lowering, the vast majority of the survivors came from these decks. Third class, the over 700 passengers from the lower decks faced massive institutional barriers. They were often intentionally delayed or held below the main decks by locked gates and uncooperative stewards, a measure originally intended to comply with U.S. immigration quarantine laws. When they finally found their way to the boat deck, often via convoluted service stairs, most of the boats had already left. Their survival rate was devastatingly low. Only 25% of third-class passengers survived, compared to 62% of first-class passengers. The third-class passengers who did make it to the deck, however, displayed immense courage. One powerful narrative is the collective effort of the groups of Scandinavian and Irish immigrants who helped ensure their women and children got into the final boats before the total collapse of order. Furtime acts of chivalry and unfading devotion. Amidst the growing chaos, the boat deck became a stage for incredible acts of personal courage, sacrifice, and devotion, embodying the highest ideals of the women and children first policy. Isidore and Ida Strauss, the elderly, beloved first-class couple, co-owners of Macy's. When Ida was offered a seat in a lifeboat, she refused, saying, "I will not separate from my husband. As we have lived, so we will die together." She stepped back and gave her seat to her maid. Isidore, also offered a seat because of his age, refused as well, saying he would not go before younger men. They were last seen standing arm in arm on the deck. Benjamin Guggenheim, the wealthy American industrialist, upon realizing the gravity of the situation, reportedly dressed impeccably in his finest evening clothes with his valet, saying, "We've dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." His deceasee, Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, moved systematically from room to room, urging passengers to put on their life belts, ensuring they understood the danger, and calmly helping them find their way to the boat deck. He was never seen attempting to save himself. His final reported sighting was in the first-class smoking room, staring at a painting titled "The Approach to the New World," having done everything he could for his creation and its inhabitants. Weiser, the musician's last stand, perhaps the most famous act of collective heroism, involved the 8 members of the ship's orchestra, led by violinist Wallace Hartley. As the chaos intensified, they moved from the first-class lounge to the forward boat deck, playing light, ragtime music to keep spirits up and maintain a semblance of order. Their music was a psychological anchor against the rising tide of panic. As the slant of the deck became perilous and the final boats pushed off, the band played on. Survivors later testified to hearing their final piece. Most believe it was the hymn, Nearer, My God, to Thee, though some recalled the uplifting Autumn. The or specific tune is debated, but the sacrifice is not. The musicians played until the very end, offering a final, beautiful act of human dignity and courage in the face of inevitable destruction. They all perished. By 2:05 a.m., only 2 of the 20 lifeboats remained. The collapsible lifeboats A and B, the ship was listing heavily. The propellers were out of the water, and the final moments of the world's greatest ship were at hand. The struggle for survival was over. The final tragic plunge was about to begin. This section details the critical hours of evacuation, focusing on the fatal flaw of insufficient lifeboats, the half-empty launches, the social inequity, and the profound acts of sacrifice. Would you like to continue the story with the 8th subtitle, The Lights Go Out, the Final? Violent plunge of the great liner. The lights go out. The final violent plunge of the great liner. The angle of no return. The bow submerges. By 1:45 a.m. on April 15, 1912, the situation on the boat deck was one of desperate terminal clarity. The launch of the final wooden lifeboats, lifeboats 10, 11, 12, and 14 was achieved, with increasing difficulty as the port side of the ship became severely listed. The water was now lapping at the railing of the forward well deck, and the famed unsinkable claim had dissolved into terrifying, inescapable reality. The flooding in the 5 forward compartments had dragged the massive bow deeply below the surface. The angle of the ship, the infamous bow-down angle, was now undeniable, making the sloping deck a treacherous hazard. The ship's 3 immense bronze propellers, normally submerged, were now clearly visible, lifted high out of the water against the brilliant backdrop of the stars. The remaining passengers, realizing the imminent danger, surged toward the stern aft section, hoping that buoyancy would keep that portion afloat longer. Captain Smith, having ensured the last boats were lowered, released the officers and crew from their duty. It was every man for himself. A final acknowledgement of the tragedy's absolute scope. 2. The final moments of the engine room, deep in the belly of the ship. The Black Gang, the engineers and firemen, carried out a final, heroic duty that ensured the lifeboats had the best possible chance. While the upper decks descended into panic, these men remained at their posts, working in waist-deep freezing water. Their task was not to save the ship, but to keep the electrical generators running until the absolute last moment. Without electricity, the lights on deck would fail. The wireless would die, and crucially, the large winches or cranes used to swing out the lifeboats would cease to function. Chief Engineer Joseph Bell and his team performed a supreme act of sacrifice, toiling in the increasingly flooded engine room to maintain power. Their commitment bought the time necessary to launch the final few boats. None of the 35 engineers survived. They were true heroes of the tragedy. 3. The Great Blackout, Silence and Darkness. At approximately 2:18 a.m., as the angle of the deck reached a point of no return, around 15, the immense pressure of the flooding water overwhelmed the engines and the boilers. There was a sudden, violent flicker, and then the thousands of electric lights that illuminated the decks in public. Rooms of the Titanic snapped out. The sudden, absolute darkness was more terrifying to the remaining passengers than the slope. The electric glow of the floating palace was replaced by the terrifying vastness of the Atlantic night. This darkness was broken only by the cold, distant stars and the pathetic beams of a few flashlights held by the crew. Concurrent with the blackout, 2 of the final collapsible lifeboats, A and B, were finally cut free from the roof of the officers' quarters, but they were swamped and flipped over in the rapidly rising water, becoming mere floating rafts. 4th, the breakup, a structure overwhelmed. As the bow sank deeper, the forces acting upon the ship became unimaginable. The stern, now hanging high in the air, was subjected to immense, unsupported strain, a colossal weight pulling against the relatively weak structure of the midship section. At 2:18 a.m., the stress became too great. Eyewitnesses in the lifeboats watching from a distance saw a horrifying event. The Titanic's back broke. There was a sound like a giant tearing of cloth, followed by a series of deep, booming reports, the sound of the huge keel plates and internal structure fracturing. The ship violently pitched forward, and the break occurred near the third and fourth funnels, violently splitting the 882-foot liner into two distinct sections. The heavy, water-filled bow section, which immediately began its terminal vertical plunge. The lighter stern section, which momentarily righted itself and settled back onto the water, bobbing precariously, held up by the air trapped in the now exposed rear compartments. This was the traumatic climax of the sinking. The violent breakup flung hundreds of passengers and crew members into the freezing water. With a final plunge, 2 minutes past 2. The stern section, still full of panicked passengers and crew clinging to the railings, remained afloat for only 2 more minutes. It then began its own final tragic journey. As water surged over the upper decks, the stern rose high, perhaps to a vertical position, before it too was claimed by the ocean. At 2:20 a.m. on Monday, April 15, 1912, the last visible part of the RMS Titanic, the stern, slid beneath the surface of the North Atlantic, disappearing forever into the absolute silence of the depths. The sinking was complete, for the lost heroes a final dedication. The last moments of the disaster were marked by the profound courage of the men who had built and commanded the ship. Captain Edward John Smith. Having fulfilled his final duty, Smith made no attempt to save himself. He was last seen on the bridge, or possibly near the wheelhouse performing a final salute, reportedly saying, "Be British, boys, be British." His body was never recovered. He went down with his ship, upholding the highest tradition of maritime command, Thomas Andrews. The designer's fate was sealed by his own calculations. He was last seen in the first-class smoking room, staring at the painting, having given his life belt to a woman, and his final words of encouragement to many others. He died a hero, ensuring the survival of as many as possible before quietly accepting his own end. J. Bruce Ismay, the White Star chairman, in stark contrast to Smith and Andrews, did manage to find a place in the last lowering lifeboat, collapsible sea, a decision that would define the rest of his life and career, leading to public condemnation and ruin for years to come. The scene left behind was horrific. Hundreds of people struggling in the freezing. Domanier. F2. Water screaming in agony. The screams, which survivors recalled as the most unbearable sound of the night, slowly faded over the next 20 minutes as the cold claimed victim after victim. The majestic Titanic was gone, and the terrible silence that followed was broken only by the mournful sound of the ocean and the pitiful cries of the dying. This section now details the ship's final descent, the heroic efforts of the engineers, the structural breakup, and the final moments of the key figures aboard. Would you like to continue the story with the 9th subtitle? Echoes on the Waves, the Carpathia's Race in the Morning After? Echoes on the Waves, the Carpathia's Race in the Morning After. At the race against time, Carpathia hears the call. The RMS Carpathia, a modest Cunard liner carrying about 700 passengers, was traveling eastward from New York to Fiume, Rijeka, when, at approximately 12:20 a.m., April 15, 1912, her wireless operator, Harold Cottam, picked up the frantic CQD and then SOS calls from the Titanic. The giant liner, boasting of her sinking, transmitted her position coordinates along with the chilling message. "We have struck an iceberg and are sinking by the head." Cottam immediately roused Captain Arthur Rostron, a devout, methodical, and immensely capable commander. Rostron, despite his initial skepticism about the message's severity, took no chances. He was 58 nautical miles away, a distance that, at Carpathia's normal top speed of 14.5 knots, would take nearly 4 hours to cover. Rostron immediately gave the order that would define his legacy. "Full speed ahead!" He pushed the Carpathia to her absolute limit, reaching an unprecedented 17 knots, a speed far exceeding her safety rating. He ordered the heat and steam normally, reserved for passenger comfort, to be diverted entirely to the engines. Every off-duty crew member was sent to scan the horizon for ice, and the ship's internal systems were entirely rearranged. Heating was cut off, hot water was prepared, and the ship's medical facilities and dining saloons were readied to receive up to 2,000 injured and freezing survivors. The race was tense, dangerous, and utterly necessary. The Carpathia steamed directly through the same dangerous ice field that had claimed the Titanic, maneuvering frantically between icebergs, trusting in Captain Rostron's keen eyesight and navigation skills. But dawn breaks, a scene of desolation. As the Carpathia rushed toward the coordinates, the first pale light of dawn broke over the North Atlantic. At 3:30 a.m., the Carpathia began passing large chunks of ice, and the engines were slowed. At 4 a.m., a crewman spotted the first object, a small, dark shape bobbing on the vast gray sea. It was lifeboat number 2 carrying 18 survivors. The Carpathia had arrived. The scene that greeted the rescuers was one of profound desolation and chilling silence. The beautiful, smooth sea that had fooled the lookouts was now a grim, placid graveyard, littered with the flotsam of a destroyed civilization. Deck chairs, carved wood, personal luggage, and the occasional heartbreaking piece of clothing. But the worst sight was the water itself. Hundreds of bodies floated lifelessly, claimed by the extreme cold of the water, which induces fatal hypothermia or cold shock in less than 15 minutes. The screams of the dying had mercifully stopped long ago, replaced by an eerie quiet. 3. The process of rescue and shock. The rescue effort was methodical and agonizingly slow. The Carpathia spent the next 4 hours locating and pulling up the 20 lifeboats that had managed to successfully launch from the Titanic. The process involved carefully maneuvering the large liner to approach each small boat, then using ropes and canvas chairs to haul the survivors aboard one by one. The condition of the survivors varied greatly, but all were suffering from exposure and shock.
It didn't stand still.
Those in the
for a single
lifeboats,
moment.
though freezing and emotionally shattered, they were alive. They were wrapped in blankets, given hot coffee, and tended to by the Carpathia's crew and her own passengers. The wealthy first-class survivors often exhibited extreme shock and silence, their comfortable world shattered. Those on collapsible boats A and B, these survivors, including the wireless operator Harold Bride, had spent hours clinging to the upturned, waterlogged hulls of the collapsible boats, their feet and hands submerged in the icy sea. They were dangerously hypothermic and required immediate medical attention. The deck of the Carpathia became a sudden, chaotic intersection of the world's highest and lowest social classes. Millionaires and destitute immigrants huddled together under the same blankets, unified by the shared trauma. Bathed the sea of grief, counting the lost. As the survivors were brought aboard, a terrible count began. By 8:30 a.m., the final lifeboat, number 12, was hauled aboard, and Captain Rostron determined that all possible lifeboats had been found. He then made one last painful sweep of the area, searching for any sign of life but found only debris. Rostron was faced with the agonizing task of confirming the scale of the disaster. The Carpathia had saved only 705 people. The final toll was grim, 1503. Passengers and crew members had perished. The survivors, the 705 individuals, were an uneven statistical representation of the Titanic society. Children 50 out of 109 survived, 46%. Women 316 out of 422 survived, 75%. Men 340 out of 1690 survived, 20%. Crew 214 out of 892 survived, 24%. The profound difference in survival rates among the classes was also brutally apparent. 62% of first-class passengers survived, versus only 25% of third-class passengers. The unsinkable ship had sunk, and the Edwardian social hierarchy had determined who would be saved. The voyage to New York, the silent burden. With no further possibility of rescue, Captain Rostron reluctantly turned the Carpathia toward New York. The atmosphere aboard the small liner shifted from the adrenaline of rescue to the crushing weight of grief. The survivors, packed into the ship, were now consumed by the terrifying knowledge of who was not there. Wives searched desperately for husbands, and children cried for fathers who had ensured their safe passage and then stood back to face their inevitable end. Mrs. Isidore Strauss was not there. Colonel Astor was not there. Thomas Andrews was not there. The silence on the Carpathia was broken by the quiet sobs of the widows and orphans. The task of sending the news to shore fell to the overworked wireless operators. The first official public message confirming the sinking was sent, and when the news finally hit New York on the evening of Monday, April 15th, it plunged the world into shock and disbelief. The most